Well, last year, my team and I, beginning in late July and through the middle and early part of August, surveyed grower fields, both soybean and corn fields, throughout the state. We were in 47 different counties, and within each of those counties, we selected randomly 5 soybean fields and 5 adjacent corn fields. Within the soybean fields, we used a sweep net and went out into those fields, took 100 sweeps, which is a pretty standard thing to do for survey-type projects. Within the cornfields, we took beetle counts, western corn rootworm adult beetle counts, and I wanted to look at densities of insects not only in soybeans, but those western corn rootworm densities in corn to get an idea, how abundant some key pests were last year. I've been seeing a lot of insect densities trending lower and lower through the years. So I wanted to quantify that a bit more this year and then share that information with growers at the 2012 Corn and Soybean Classics.
So you find that insect numbers were continuing to decline in fields?
Yes, and in fact, in some counties, the numbers were really, amazingly low. We've known, for instance, that western corn rootworm adult populations tend to be much lower in the southern half of the state anyway. But in some counties, we struggled to even find a single western corn rootworm adult in some of those cornfields. So that's pretty odd, especially as you get into late July and early August. Densities of insects out in soybean fields were also very low. Some familiar insects would include things like Japanese beetles, bean leaf beetles, green clover worms. Again, populations were very low. And I think, in terms of trying to explain why the densities were so low, if we look at corn, we know that BT use has been very high and continues to be high and projected to be high for 2012. We've had some very wet springs, particularly late May and early June, which tends to work against good survivorship of western corn rootworms. And then I think when you look at the frequency of fungicide and insecticide tank mixes and those sprays being applied to both corn and soybeans, I think that tends to also suppress insect populations quite a lot. And so at the Corn and Soybean Classics, I'm asking producers, for instance, if they use these tank mixes, these fungicide insecticide sprays, how frequently they were used, and if they scouted before they used them. So I'm trying to get some more precise feedback at these meetings as well. I'd like to continue these surveys over the next several years and then begin to compare where these densities are for a number of different insects, going back to data that we have for the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s to really begin to make some comparisons in terms of where we're at for some of these key pests in the state.
Did you find any new pests in your surveys here for Illinois?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because one of the goals of the survey was to look specifically for some new stink bug species that are making their way into the state. The brown marmorated stink bug is now present and has been confirmed in 4 different counties of the state. We did not detect any brown marmorated in our surveys in soybean fields, but so far they have been showing up in those 4 counties, Champaign, McLean, Cook County, some more urban areas. They have a wide host range, but that's a stink bug that's well established in the mid-Atlantic states and is moving further west every year and is now in about 33 states east of the Mississippi, but also has hitchhiked its way all the way out to California, Washington, and Oregon. The other 2 stink bug species, red-banded and red-shouldered stink bugs, they're more common in the southeastern United States. And the good news is we didn't detect any of those other species as well. But I think it's something that we'll continue to have to look at because the red-banded, red-shouldered continue to move further north. And as the climate continues to change, we anticipate those are species that'll probably move northward.
Well, there's been a lot in the news, too, particularly with as farmers are concerned about the brown stink bug and its effects on crops out in the Northeast and what it could potentially do, and something for growers just to kind of be paying attention to at this time?
Well, I think that's right. Brown marmorated, because it can feed on both soybeans as well as corn, we know is causing mid-Atlantic producers quite a few headaches. But also, it feeds on a wide variety of fruits and vegetables. So our fruit and vegetable producers are also going to have to kind of keep an eye out for this particular insect. And I'm sure many people remember the multicolored Asian lady beetles and how they try to get into homes to overwinter. Well, this brown marmorated stink bug, unfortunately, has that characteristic as well. And as the days get shorter and the temperatures get cooler as we get into fall, they try to move into homes to overwinter. So a lot of our homeowners are going to get, I think, pretty frustrated with the behavior of that insect, that's for sure.
Back to what's going on in fields, in particular cornfields, the western corn rootworm, your survey information back on that, and a lot of farmers will be interested to hear those numbers and also if there's some resistance issues to some of the cry proteins.
Well, that's right. Last year, a researcher at Iowa State published a paper in which he talked about the evolution of resistance to one particular type of Bt protein, Cry3BB1, in some producers' fields in eastern and northeastern Iowa. Not long after he published his paper, midsummer last year, I started to get some reports from some producers and seed company representatives in northwestern, north central Illinois. Went to those producer fields and confirmed very significant levels of root feeding on some Bt hybrids that express that 3BB1 protein. The fields all shared some common characteristics. They had been in continuous corn for many years. They'd used that same trait for many years. And so it matched some of what the Iowa State researcher had talked about in his paper. So we collected the adults and provided those to Iowa State, Aaron Gassman, the scientist there, to run some similar bioassays on those. And we won't have the results of those bioassays until sometime this spring. And then we'll have a better sense for what the mechanism behind those failures were. So even though Aaron has, talked about resistance development in Iowa, we've yet to confirm that in Illinois. But nonetheless, those producers had very poor performance of those Bt hybrids in their fields. And we know also that there are some reports coming out of some other states like Nebraska where the performance issues are increasingly being reported.
But that was one insect that you had a hard time finding oftentimes in fields?
In some areas of the state more so than others. Certainly in southern Illinois, parts of extreme western Illinois, the western corn rootworm adult densities were very, very low. If you get into some areas of northwestern Illinois, north central Illinois, the numbers were higher, but still, when we compare those numbers with historic numbers up in those areas of the state, I would still say they were low to moderate.
Is there a reason they're lower now than they have been historically?
Well, again, I think because we've had successive years of very wet springs, lots of rain, saturated soils in late May and early June. That tends to work against good establishment by corn rootworms. Increasing Bt usage, certainly, increasing soil insecticide usage, and then those fungicide insecticide tank mixes being sprayed to both corn and soybeans. So we're at a point now where the number of inputs, the volume of inputs going into corn production is very significant, and so it's just a matter of time before those low numbers start to reflect all of those inputs that are going into controlling corn rootworms. And I might add that's part of the message that I'm speaking about at these Corn and Soybean Classics, and that is that there are long-term consequences of heavy input usage, first and foremost being, resistance development.
Farmers are hearing that message on a lot of different fronts, aren't they, Mike?
Well, they are. I know Aaron Gassman, of course, published his paper over at Iowa State last year. Aaron Hager at this particular conference is talking about Palmer amaranth, a very impressive weed species that seems to be moving further north and is resistant to a number of different herbicides, including glyphosate. So when we utilize some of these production inputs over and over and over again in the same fields and really don't integrate, right? I mean, integrated pest management, the key there is to utilize a lot of different management tactics and not rely or over-rely on a single one every year, then we get ourselves into trouble at some point.
Do you ever find anyone that maybe is a bit surprised that insects are developing these resistances right along with plants? Is it unexpected that the insects would be doing this as well, or do people understand that this is just part of evolution?
Well, insects have shown their ability to develop resistance to many different classes of insecticides. So, within the scientific community, certainly, we know that insects have a tremendous ability to develop resistance to just about any management tactic you throw at them. And producers here in Illinois, I know should remember well that the western corn rootworm even was able to overcome crop rotation because of the over-reliance on a corn and soybean rotation. Western corn rootworms came into the state in 1964. And by the mid to late 1980s, there was evidence that they were adapting to crop rotation. Females were laying eggs out in soybean fields, especially through east central Illinois, not just corn as they had historically done. So this was a spectacular example of evolution to a cultural practice, that being crop rotation. So insects, most especially the western corn rootworm, have developed resistance to rotation, chlorinated hydrocarbons, to some organophosphates. We shouldn't be very surprised that they can develop resistance to some of these cry proteins as well.
You mentioned, I think, some of the things that producers should be looking forward to in 2012, maybe even 2013, when it comes to planning on what to do in fields. But are there specific steps that you want them to take when considering some of these issues?
Well, again, I think go back and, integrate tactics. Consider, if you've been in continuous corn for many years, I know corn in many areas is very profitable. I know there are reasons why growers, grow continuous corn, especially in northern, northwestern Illinois. They have livestock operations. But if you can rotate, that makes really good sense. Rather than rely upon a BT hybrid every year, consider the use of a non-BT hybrid. If you're concerned about rootworm pressure in that non-BT hybrid, consider using a soil insecticide. If you still want to stick with a BT hybrid, consider using a BT hybrid that expresses a different cry protein. In other words, just mix it up and don't do the same thing year in and year out.
This mild winter that we are experiencing, will it have an effect on insects? Mild winter, first of all, a lot of insects migrate into the state of Illinois every year, and so our winters really don't have an effect for a lot of insects like black cutworms, green clover worms, potato leaf hoppers, corn earworms, fall armyworms. These are insects that are pretty familiar to a lot of Illinois producers. They actually overwinter in the southeastern United States, so our winters really don't have much of an effect on many species. There are some, obviously, western corn rootworm coming to mind, but those are eggs tucked down, into layers in the soil, and they're superbly adapted to our winter conditions. Bean leaf beetles overwinter in the state, and mild winters will probably tend to work in their favor. Corn flea beetles overwinter in the state. Mild winters will probably tend to work in their favor. So in answering that question, it really depends upon the species you're talking about. Do they overwinter in the state, or do they overwinter in the southeastern U.S.?